Welcome to AP European History with Mr. Bobby. Today we will be discussing Chapter 16, Sections 1 and 3 from the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text, 7th edition, Absolutism and Constitutionalism in Western Europe. And today we'll be focusing in on absolutism. And when we think absolutism, we have to associate that primarily with France. Between 1589 and 1715, European governments were either absolute monarchies or constitutional states. As I just mentioned, absolute monarchies we most closely associate with France. Constitutional states we most closely associate with England. And this is kind of bridging a gap, okay, between medieval governments and modern governments. And when we coined the phrase absolutism, which came out much after the rule of Louis XIV and others, it was devised that it's a form of government with unlimited power held by one individual, and that individual is namely the king. He ruled by what was called divine right, meaning that his authority came from God, and God was alone who he answered to. Most of the time a king, sometimes a queen. And there was a firm belief in moving towards centralizing power. And what all of the key players in this chapter are doing are motivating, they're motivated and struggling with centralizing power and central rule, the creation of bureaucracies, standing armies. And one of the number one indicators of success is how these governments were able to handle financial problems. French absolutism starts with Henry of Navarre, who becomes Henry IV in 1589, and we recall from last chapter the War of the Three Henrys. And Henry really lays the foundations for a long reign by the Bourbons. He is successful in lowering taxes, achieving peace, and controlling the nobility. He establishes a key term in your text, Paulette, which is an annual fee paid by royal officials to guarantee heredity to their office, another source of raising revenue. And he is the monarch until 1610, when he's assassinated by Catholic religious fanatics. In order to take the throne and create stability, he converts to Catholicism. He was originally a French Huguenot, a Calvinist. He does this to appease his opponents, and at the same time, as his review from chapter 15, he issues the Edict of Nantes, allowing Protestant worship to continue in areas where Protestants were the majority, and this was about 150 townships or areas throughout France. Huguenots only made up approximately 10% of the population. And it barred Protestant worship in Paris and other Catholic strongholds. We cannot start talking about the foundations and about Henry's success without talking about the Duke of Sully. And there are two people that we'll get to, the Duke of Sully and Cardinal Richelieu, who assists Henry's son, Louis XIII. But first, the Duke of Sully. He's Henry's finance minister, and he is incredibly smart, and he is incredibly good at managing the finances. He is able to decrease taxes while increasing revenue through a revival in trade. He eliminates financial inefficiency and corruption, and he really helps Henry set the foundations for what is to come. Following him is another extremely important figure, and that's Cardinal Richelieu. And Richelieu takes over as kind of a de facto ruler of France behind the scenes, because Louis XIII is only 9 years old when he succeeds the throne. First, it starts with his mother, Marie de Medici, but then Richelieu takes over, and he's appointed chief minister in 1624. And he controls the policies of the crown and really solidifies this centralized French government. He demands total subordination of all groups to the crowns, most specifically the nobility, and he really goes on a hunt for the nobility, because he knows that that's the key in all of these countries, is cutting the nobility off from their prominence. So he levels their castles. He forms a great administrative system, which is perhaps his most significant impact on France. 32 provinces, local authority called the intendants, okay, and they do everything from collecting the local taxes to reporting and spying on the nobility and really creating an atmosphere that makes the nobility uncomfortable and really kind of keeps moving that power up the chain and centralizing it in the monarch. Louis, as he gets older, Louis the 13th, has some very different ideas about things than his father did. He sees the Edict of Nantes as allowing a state within a state. So he goes on the attack and he reinstitutes Catholic Mass and attempts to drive out most of the Calvinists. In 1628, he defeats La Rochelle, which was the largest Calvinist stronghold, and this instigates many protests about taxation. There are food shortages, domestic violence, but he moves forward with it anyway. And really, this is going to, in the long run, make sure that Richelieu and then Louis XIV never are able to realize all of their goals, specifically financially for France, because taking away all of the skilled artisans and craftsmen that belong to the Calvinists really does hurt the economy to at least a small extent. We know Richelieu is the one who seeks to weaken the Habsburgs by supporting the Protestants in the 30 Years' War, even though he's Catholic. Other contributions, the French Academy, which prepares a French dictionary to standardize language, and we'll move even further ahead with that with Louis XIV. And then your book mentions the Fronde, and these are these civil wars or uprisings to oppose policies of the government. And the Fronde is significant because it is going to greatly influence Louis XIV's policies about a central state and about the importance of order. Foreshadowing what's to come ahead, Mazarin succeeds Richelieu as the finance minister and chief minister for Louis XIV, and he's going to continue to move ahead with Richelieu's legacy of centralization. The granddaddy of all monarchs in Europe. With the passing of Louis XIII, the child king, Louis XIV, starts his reign in 1643 at the age of 4. He reigns then for 72 years, the longest in modern European history. He's a devout Catholic, also known as the Sun King, partially because of his fascination with Apollo. And he's deeply devout in Catholicism and deeply immersed in French language and culture that are really going to become a new international style and seen as the new Latin, if you will, that will be spoken in many of the courts, princely courts across Europe. During his reign, and we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit, he really accomplishes some pretty major things. A huge bureaucracy made up of the bourgeoisie, which was the middle class, and bureaucracy is all kinds of government agencies, kind of cutting the nobility out. A large standing army and an enormous central treasury, although he does fall short there because Louis likes to spend, as evidenced by Versailles. He ties the nobility to the service of the king and state, and he houses his court at Versailles. And Versailles is a very beautiful place. It's still there today, and it was meant to intimidate. He kept adding on to it, and he requires nobles to stay there for part of the year to kind of keep them close. Versailles is meant to intimidate and awe people, and every last detail of Versailles, down to the doorknobs, is planned out by Louis to represent this absolutist centralized power of the monarch. As Louis goes after consciously separating power from status, which is something that he really does to the nobility by making them feel somewhat inferior and not included, but by also emphasizing that they're still not taxed, so they still have their status. He just wants to take away their power. Finances plague the country. There are shady tax farmers, which were people who bought the rights to collect taxes and then would skim off the top. Little taxation of the nobility and middle class, and then a heavy burden on the peasants. And this is going to plague Louis throughout most of his reign, especially when we get to spending money on wars. His Minister of Finance is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And Colbert, after he moves in and starts his reign as the Minister of Finance, institutes the policy of mercantilism. This is government policy to regulate the economy. High tariffs, preventing competition with French goods, selling lots of goods abroad but buying nothing back, and seeing all of the colonies that he's about to amass in North America as being for the good and the purpose of France. He subsidizes industry, invites skilled craftsmen from other countries, builds roads and canals, and creates a merchant marine to protect all of the shipping that they were doing. However, he doesn't focus so much on the agricultural economy, and this really suffers during his reign, mainly because of their heavy tax burden, but also the population decline and poor harvests. A couple explorers from France that are quite famous: Robert La Salle, who basically discovers and explores what we know today as Louisiana, and then Marquette and Joliet, who sail down the Mississippi. The other thing that Louis does is he finally revokes the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and he orders new laws that destroy churches, close schools, and moves towards baptizing all Huguenots, rebaptizing them as Catholics. The French monarchy never really intended for religious toleration to be permanent. Religious unity, as we've been saying over the past couple of chapters, was considered a political necessity. And the quote, as it goes from Louis: "One king, one law, one faith." Other motivations for Louis: it was not a popular policy, and revoking it won him a lot of praise. And it really had very minor scattered effects on the French economic development, even though early scholars and historians talk about the loss of Huguenot businessmen as being devastating. Now that we've looked back on it a little bit more closely, we can understand that it wasn't good for the economy, but there were a lot of other factors combined that made things difficult on the French economy, primarily Louis' spending. Section 3, a very brief section in your text, talks about art and literature, and this period in France specifically is called French Classicism. And French Classicism is any art and literature during the age of Louis XIV. It imitated the subject matter and the style of classical antiquity, meaning of the Greeks and Romans, and reverting back to the Renaissance, which is a couple hundred years old now. And it possessed discipline, balance, and restraint. Under Louis, the principles of absolutism molded the ideas of French classicism, and he was a rather fond patron of many of the arts. He loved composers Lully and Couperin and Carpenter, playwrights Molière, who wrote comedies, and Racine, who wrote tragedies, and perhaps the most exemplary French classicist, the painter Nicolas Poussin. Okay, pictured on this slide is the rape of the Sabine women. Rape in this case meaning kidnapping, and he was so detailed and structured that the buildings in this painting in the background are often considered to be some of the most accurate depictions of those actual buildings. So, lots going on in France at this period of time, and it will continue to go on in the next lecture as France changes even more drastically as Louis starts to look to expand.